And he asked him, "Do you believe in life after death?" "Oh, yes, sir," the clerk replied. "Oh, that's good," said the boss. "After you left early yesterday to go to your grandmother's funeral, she stopped in to see you." Now, the question about life after death is an important one. It is a big one. It's one we've all spent time thinking about at some point or other in our lives. It's one that my own daughter Sophia is struggling with right now, and I feel bad for her, her poor 9-year-old little mind trying to grasp this big concept, and we have all these conversations about it. For all of us, I think it speaks to our fear about what happens next, about the unknown, but it might also inform how we are to live our lives in the now. It might move us to live life to the fullest, or carpe diem, as they say. Or the fear of death might cause us to wallow in despair, or give us great anxiety. But I hope this question makes us consider what life is all about, and how we ought to be living. Now, there are a lot of voices that claim to know what life is about. Advertising slogans try to convince us that life is about acquiring such and such a product. Self-help books and seminars teach us that life is about personal growth. Our desires try to convince us that life is about satisfying our appetites for love, sex, and pleasure. Or we might even find politicians trying to tell us what life is all about. And I could even imagine one particularly loud voice declaring, "Believe me, no one knows more about life than I do." There are a lot of voices that promise the meaning of life. There are a lot of voices that claim to show us abundance. But on this Good Shepherd Sunday, we would be wise to trust in the one who leads us and cares for his sheep, who cares for us like no one else. In our gospel reading today, Christ likens himself to a shepherd who cares for his sheep. That makes us the sheep, which isn't the most flattering of comparisons. Is that my mic? That's I guess it might be. I don't know why. I'll try not to move. I haven't had that problem before like that. Okay. I turn it off, but then our camera's not going to pick it up, so. Thunder. All right. Like I said, the comparison to be sheep isn't always the most flattering, sheep being of rather limited intelligence. But while that may be the case, we have to give credit to the sheep for this, and that comes out in our story today. Sheep know their master's voice. Sheep can differentiate between the voice of a stranger and the voice of their master. They know the one who leads them and cares for them and offers them life. And the Good Shepherd promises them and promises all of us today, "I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." Now, in John's Gospel, we find that life is one of the author's key concepts. He talks about life a lot. He uses the term 36 times, in fact. And usually he refers to life as eternal life, which we might think of as spending eternity with God. But here there is a stronger sense that true life, or life that derives its source from heaven, from things eternal, is active and present in the here and now. And it's based on having a relationship with the Good Shepherd, Jesus Christ. And it is in the context of this relationship that the richest and fullest life may be lived. One commentary says that the Greek phrase used for having life more abundantly means to have a superabundance of that life, a superabundance of a thing. To be a follower of Jesus, to know who he is and what he means, is to have a superabundance of life. There's a story of a Roman soldier who came to Julius Caesar one day with a request to commit suicide. He wanted permission to commit this act from his general. He was a wretched, dispirited creature with no vitality. And Caesar looked at him and said, "Man, were you ever really alive?" It's so often the case when we try to live our own lives, it can be quite dull, dispirited, empty. But when we walk with Jesus, there comes a new vitality, superabundance of life. It is only when we live with Christ that life is really worth living, and we begin to live in the real sense of the word. And that fullness of life is found in the Good Shepherd's fold, as a member of his holy heap of sheep. And this life isn't a private affair either, as if one could live as the only sheep of the Good Shepherd's flock. But Jesus said that he came for they, all the sheep of his flock. And the Bible, throughout its pages, reveals that we were created, humanity was created for relationship with our Creator. But we are also intended to live in community with one another, so that together, as a family, a nation, a community of faith, as one holy Catholic and apostolic church, we may experience the richness of life together. Now, the Acts of the Apostles, which we heard from this morning, I believe shows us a clear picture of what that abundant life looks like, lived out in the community of the early church. His followers demonstrated to the world Christ's love for them in the way that they related and treated and spoke with one another. And I'd like to suggest today that we might learn a few valuable principles as to how we ought to be treating one another. And when we follow this path, our lives will be filled with great richness and life. There are three sort of key points or principles that I would like to take today's meeting that might speak to our spiritual lives. Now, the first is this. Those early Christians in the community described in the book of Acts is first of all committed to the common purpose. They are committed to the common purpose. In Acts 2:42, we hear, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching." The early church knew that their purpose in life was contained within the gospel message that was proclaimed by Jesus' closest followers. That message is the one we've been hearing throughout Easter, that Jesus was crucified and died for the forgiveness of sins, and on the third day was raised by God and appeared to many witnesses. And these Christians believed with all their hearts and minds that faith in Jesus was the key to abundant life. And their purpose was to live this out in their own lives, to share that message with any who would hear it. We know that having a purpose makes a difference. That's why books like The Purpose-Driven Life became so popular. People have an innate desire to find purpose and meaning for their lives. So when one finds the purpose for living, how could one's life not be changed? And the disciples themselves are transformed from sniveling cowards, like Caesar's soldier, into fearless ambassadors for Christ. And that message, this good news, drew them together. They began to realize that what brought them together was infinitely greater than what would threaten to tear them apart. They were thankful for what God had done in their own lives. And out of the abundance of forgiveness that they'd received, they were able to share it with one another. It became easier, freer for them to forgive those who have wronged them. Differences of opinion get put in perspective when one recognizes that one is only a single humble sheep in the Good Shepherd's flock. Now, the second principle I think we can take from the church in today's reading is that they were also committed to spiritual growth. This group met for Eucharist and prayers regularly. They spent much time together in the temple, praising God, we read in verses 46 to 47. Now, we've probably all heard that expression that fellow is so heavenly minded, he's no earthly good. You've heard that one before. But I wonder if it could not also be the case that sometimes we're no earthly good because we're not heavenly minded enough. See, going to church and other spiritual activities can be fairly low on our priority lists, and that could be for many reasons. But the early church did not make excuses for neglecting their spiritual lives. In fact, it seemed to renew them and give them an energy and fuel them on in their lives and in their mission and in their purpose. I believe when we direct our eyes to God in prayer and in worship, we take our eyes off of ourselves, even if only for that time. But when we do so, we are changed. We experience something transcendent. We gain new perspective on ourselves and on our world. I've had people ask me, why does God need our worship? When actually, I think it's the other way around. We're the ones who need worship because we're the ones who need to connect with God and give God his due. Lastly and thirdly, I'd like to take a point from this reading that Christ's followers were also deeply devoted to one another. They put other people's needs ahead of their own. Verse 45, we read that they had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. I think we kind of smirk sometimes when we hear verses like this. It might seem unrealistic and impractical to our North American ears. If we're politically minded, we might be often skeptical. This sounds a lot like socialism or communism. And to be sure, this kind of ideal might be unattainable to most of us. But the principle of the sharing of goods was that the church was in the habit of redistributing its wealth. Those who needed help got help from each other. And I think this can apply not only to material possessions and money, but also to the practice of putting other people first, of responding to the needs and concerns of our fellow sheep, indeed of our fellow men. I think it means we also want to try to give people the benefit of the doubt before assuming they're wrong or that they're out to mean us harm. It means we have higher standards for how we treat each other and how we speak to each other. Today we are reminded that Jesus came so that we would have abundant life. And the fullness of this life is experienced in the context of our faith community as the sheep of the Good Shepherd. Christ gathers us into his fold so that he may care and provide for us in ways no one else. And I believe that when we are cognizant of that truth, living in close relationship to Christ, we might find ourselves also growing closer to one another. And Acts reminds us and promises us and shows us that love, that commitment, that life that we share together is something that is. And in verse 45, day by day the Lord to their number, being saved. Oh, good Shepherd, help us to hear and follow your voice. Lord, lead us to abundant, rich life. Lord, help us as your sheep to live out that life in our relationships with one another. May we be deeply devoted to you, to each other, Lord, to your word, so that all may come to see and know it. your saving love. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.